All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for a visit with the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters within this very room. What places inspire your creativity? In conjunction with National Poetry Month, join staff from the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site for an exploration of poetry and place. From colonial history to Victorian family life, the conversations around enslavement and abolition, the house at 105 Brattle Street in Cambridge rooted much of Longfellow's work. Virtually travel from room to room in the Longfellow House, considering several of Henry Longfellow's poems through the lens of their physical, intellectual, and emotional connection to his remarkable home. And this presentation is led by Supervisory Park Ranger Emily Levine. And so nearly 100 of us who are on the line watching live, and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Emily for joining us this afternoon. And Emily, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robert. Thanks to all of you. It's just a delight to see where folks are coming from to join you this afternoon to share a little bit of Henry's poetry, speak with you about the house. And I so hope that we'll be able to see at least some of you in person this upcoming season when we open the house on May 17th. I'll share a little bit more about that at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and start up my slideshow here. All right, and Robert, if this does not look correct, just let me know. Otherwise, I'll move
ahead. It looks good.
All right, thank you. So I will be offering visual descriptions for accessibility throughout the presentation. I will begin with myself. I am a white woman in my late 30s with shoulder-length dark hair and glasses. I'm wearing a National Park Ranger uniform. And my opening slide displays the name of the presentation within this very room, Poetry in Place at Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters. And today's date, April 2nd, 2024. We also have an image of the front of a large yellow Georgian mansion. So happy National Poetry Month again. If you'd like to explore more of this wonderful month, you can visit poets.org, the Academy of American Poets. And I imagine that many of you may have some familiarity with the Longfellow House, and others may be tuning in for the first time. We are a historic house museum and cultural institution managed by the U.S. National Park Service on Brattle Street, just outside of Harvard Square in Cambridge. And again, as a unit of the National Park System, we're set out to fulfill the same mission and managed in the same way as the other 420 some units of this National Park System, but we're obviously not Yosemite or Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon. What makes us special is the history that's preserved here and really the remarkable museum and archival collection. And also how over the past 50 years, the Longfellow House has evolved from really private family home into a vibrant public space that hosts tours and special events, music, poetry, family programs, and more. So I'm going to invite folks to participate in the chat a little bit throughout this presentation today. And I wonder if we could just kick off by thinking a little bit about that power of place. Tell us in the chat, if you'd like to, what's the most meaningful historic place or monument that you've visited? You can tell us in the chat. And meanwhile, on this slide, we have the question next to an image of a historic kitchen with a large wooden dining table and a large cast iron stove. So I'll take a peek in the chat here. The Lincoln Memorial, JFK's birthplace, right over in Brookline, our sister site. Bad Yashem in Israel. Plymouth Rock. FDR's home in New York, Sagamore Hill. Here they come, Teddy Roosevelt. We've got some other National Historic Sites in here. Battlefield, the North Bridge in Concord. Congress. Martin Luther King Memorial, JFK Library. These are some wonderful, wonderful sites and a really interesting variety starting to percolate here. Gettysburg. Think about to yourself, as you're thinking of these sites that you had a meaningful encounter with, what is it that you really connected to? What is it that felt so unique, that captured your intellect, captured your emotion, captured your memory. Pearl Harbor, the Walt Whitman birthplace, that's a special place in my life as well. So thank you all. I'd love to, to see these continue to come in the chat. So we are going to embark on a brief sort of virtual tour through the Longfellow House through the lens of the poetry that he wrote here. We should have plenty of time at the end for question and answer as well. Happy to chat more about the topic of the program, or if folks have questions otherwise, happy to answer those. So our next slide here, the background is the sort of faded image of that Longfellow House facade. As they appear, I will read text on 6 segments of a timeline. So let me give you just a little bit of a background for this house that inspired Longfellow's poetry. The house was first built in 1759, so many decades before the poet ever came to live in Cambridge, or before he was born. This house was built 1759, prior to the American Revolution, and it was built for a man named John Vassall. John Vassall was tremendously wealthy. He was 21 years old when he had this house built, and all of his fortune came from a very large sugar plantation in Jamaica, where he and his family enslaved hundreds of human beings. John Vassall spent much of this wealth in Cambridge. He also enslaved, at the very least, 7 people in this home. Their names were Cuba, Dinah, Malcolm, William, and 3 children, James, and 2 small boys whose names are no longer known. But this is maybe the most active area of current research in the site's history, with both local scholars and living descendants of Cuba, later known as Cuba Vassall. The people who he enslaved here on Brattle Street sort of outlasted John Vassall, their enslaver here. John Vassall was loyal to the British crown, and so on the eve of the American Revolution, he fled Cambridge and eventually returned to England. He left behind the families who he enslaved, as well as his house and very, very large property. And these people who he had enslaved began to carve out their freedom. Cuba, who we know the most about, gathered her family, her children, and her husband around her, and they began farming a small portion of this land and living in a farmhouse elsewhere. They would eventually go on in this and the next generation to own their own home, to petition successfully for reparations from John Vassall's estate, and to be important abolitionists within Boston's emerging free Black community. They are still here when George Washington arrives. So in the summer of 1775, 43-year-old George Washington, just appointed commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army by the Second Continental Congress, arrives in Cambridge. He's here to address the siege of Boston, to try to drive the British Army out of the city. And he needs a headquarters. So the Provincial Congress furnishes this very, very large and now empty Loyalist mansion on Brattle Street for him. It's strategically located, and he establishes, again, his first long-term military headquarters of the Revolution right here. It's a complex community here at headquarters. Washington is surrounded by his generals, by his staff, by paid servants, as well as by people who he enslaves at Mount Vernon, who he brings with him to Cambridge headquarters. Tony and Cuba Vassall and their family, again, also remain elsewhere on the property at this time, and likely had some interaction with Washington's camp. When evacuation day comes around, the British Army is finally driven out of Boston in March 17th of 1776. Shortly after that, Washington moves on. After Washington's period of residence, the house changes hands several times, sold to a few different owners, and in 1792 is purchased by Andrew and Elizabeth Craigie, who occupy the house until 1843. They do some of the expansions, add the porches, add the rear L. Andrew Craigie died in the early 19th century. He leaves his wife Elizabeth with quite a significant amount of debt, at which point Elizabeth begins renting rooms in the upstairs section of the house. And one of her renters in the late 1830s is a young single professor of modern languages at Harvard named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow very quickly falls in love with the history of the house. He's going through a somewhat tumultuous time in his life. He was recently widowed. His first wife, Mary Storer Potter, passed away very sadly and very suddenly in 1835. And so when he arrives here at the Craigie House in 1837, he's dealing with grief. He's fairly early in his career, and he is trying to win the affections of Frances Appleton, who will eventually become his second wife. In 1843, he finally marries Frances, known as Fanny Appleton. She becomes Fanny Longfellow, and as a wedding gift, her extremely wealthy father, Nathan Appleton, buys them this historic house as a gift. This house is old. It's not very trendy at this time to buy and live in a historic house, a colonial house. But Henry and Fanny Longfellow both are very attracted to the Washington history in particular, but they are aware of the broader history of the home, the vassals, and other periods. So this becomes the Longfellow family home for the next 3 generations. Henry really establishes his celebrity as an American poet during this time. He writes Paul Revere's Ride, Evangeline, the Song of Hiawatha, A Psalm of Life from this home. And the next 3 generations occupy it as well. So it's Henry, his daughter Alice then lives in the home her whole life and sort of turns it toward becoming a public museum. The last family member to live in the home full time is named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow Dana, known as Harry Dana, and he is the poet's grandson. In the early 20th century, Longfellow's surviving adult children, after his death, form a family-run trust called the Longfellow House Trust, and they seek to preserve this home until 1972, when they transfer it willingly to the National Park System for long-term stewardship and public access. So we've been at it for about 50 years, and we are still actively researching so many stories within this home. But let's get into the house. So this slide shows the text of a poem by Henry Longfellow, Haunted Houses, which I will read in a moment. The text is next to a photograph of the house's Victorian dining room with a circular center table, gold patterned wallpaper, and several oil painting portraits in gold frames. So in that Google Doc that Robert shared at the beginning of our time together, you can find the full text and, larger text of each of these poems. And I'll just read a selection from the beginning of Haunted Houses. And with each poem, I am going to invite you to put any phrases that especially resonate with you or especially catch your ear into the chat as we go. Haunted Houses. All houses wherein men have lived and died are haunted houses. Through the open doors, the harmless phantoms on their errands glide, with feet that make no sound upon the floors. We meet them at the doorway, on the stair. Along the passages they come and go, impalpable impressions on the air, a sense of something moving to and fro. There are more guests at table than the hosts invited. The illuminated hall is thronged with quiet, inoffensive ghosts, as silent as the pictures on the wall. The stranger at my fireside cannot see the forms I see, nor hear the sounds I hear. He but perceives what is, while unto me all that has been is visible and clear. We have no title deeds to house or lands. Owners and occupants of earlier dates from graves forgotten stretch their dusty hands and hold in mortmain still their old estates. So I will be watching the chat for any words, lines, or phrases that especially caught your ear. And this history, this sense of all houses wherein men have lived and died, was tremendously important to Henry Longfellow. While Longfellow was especially in touch with the George Washington history, he was aware again of that broader past, the harmless phantoms that a couple of folks have put into the chat. They're just gliding past him as they're doing their errands about this home. So in this room, Longfellow gathered for meals with his very close-knit circle of friends and family members, even as he was surrounded by those harmless phantoms, with their feet that make no sound upon the floors. Thank you for continuing in the chat. To him, as Marianne says, all that has been is visible and clear again, even as he's sitting around this table with his current living circle of family and friends. So I'd like to point out a few of those folks. See if we can, whoops, go on to the next. So I'm pointing here to a portrait of his wife, Fanny. It's next to a portrait of his three young daughters, Alice, Edith, and Annie Allegra. Fanny's sister Mary is here. Fanny's father and their benefactor, Nathan Appleton, is here. And here's Alice Longfellow as an adult. She, again, lived in this house her whole life, and she really worked to transition it rather, from private family home to family home and site of public interest, a public museum. She really tried to preserve the house, even as she lived in it, as she remembered it from her childhood, in a sort of homage to her father's memory and to a certain extent to Washington's. So what you're looking at here is a really remarkably intact collection. All of these objects are original to the home, original to the Longfellow family, and were transferred from the trust to the National Park Service 50 years ago. And Robert, I see a request to put that link to the poems into the chat one more time. So the rest of the poems that we read today will capture the house as both a place of historical experience, memory, and connection to a shared past for the Longfellows. But we'll also look at poems that capture it as a family home, which was full of both deep joys, very tangible living life, and deep grief at times. I love the idea of the illuminated hall just being thronged with these quiet, inoffensive ghosts, because this house has such a lively, illuminated, closely gathered feel to it, and the history, as we've been talking about, is always, always present. We are moving now to the front hall, and this slide contains the text of, or some text of, the very long poem, To a Child. There is a photo of the front hall, which includes a staircase with decorative balusters painted white, which wraps around itself. There's a bust of George Washington seated on a black pedestal near the turn of the stairs, and a bust of a woman sits on a table in the foreground. A tall grandfather clock stands on the landing of the stairs as well. So this is the front hall. Though the furnishings are from the Longfellow period, the woodwork and other architectural features point right to the colonial home, to both John Vassall's and then George Washington's time here. So again, as we listen to and read this excerpt of To a Child, again, put any phrases that especially catch your ear into that chat box. To a Child. And again, this is very early on, 1845, in the history of the Longfellow family occupying this home. Through these once solitary halls, thy pattering footstep falls. The sound of thy merry voice makes the old walls jubilant, and they rejoice with the joy of thy young heart, o'er the light of whose gladness no shadows of sadness from the somber background of memory start. One saw once within these walls one whom memory oft recalls, the father of his country dwelt, and yonder meadows broad and damp, the fires of the besieging camp encircled with a burning belt. Up and down these echoing stairs, heavy with the weight of cares, sounded his majestic tread. Yes, within this very room sat he in those hours of gloom, weary both in heart and head. But what are these grave thoughts to thee? Out, out, into the open air. Thy only dream is liberty, thou carest little how or where. I see thee eager at thy play, now shouting to the apples on the tree, with cheeks as round and red as they, and now among the yellow stalks, among the flowering shrubs and plants, as restless as the bee. This poem is very worth a full read through. Henry Longfellow is addressing the child, To a Child, his toddler son, Charlie. Charlie is just about a year and a half old at this point, already getting into all kinds of fun trouble, which will follow him around throughout his adventurous life. Susan put the phrase pattering footsteps into the chat. Henry will more famously return to this phrase, the patter of little feet, in a later poem that we'll read next. Heavy with the weight of care still feels relevant today. So at this part of the poem, Henry is really switching back and forth between family and history. Charlie is his first of eventually 6 children, and he's writing in these storied halls, imagining and telling his son about the great weary leader going up and down these stairs. But Charlie just wants to go out into the open air, right? He's about 18 months old. He's shouting at the apples on the tree. He is restless as the bee. This is a very sweet and very recognizable image juxtaposed to the majestic and world-weary memory of Washington. And Longfellow has this really intentional career-long project of shaping a uniquely American literature. He is a couple generations beyond the American Revolution. He and many of his friends have grandfathers who fought in that conflict. And he is looking to shape a literature that can culturally unite this still relatively very young nation. And to Henry, George Washington is really a key figure of that shared history. And his son in this poem is that future, right? That generation who will continue to shape the nation. And so he's imparting some of these lessons of memory, again, in juxtaposition to his very young son. So you can think a little bit more about sort of who George Washington appears to be in this poem. Again, Eva Jane, heavy with the weight of care, still feels relevant to potentially ourselves as well as our public figures today. And, you know, a really sort of trying to cast him as a unifying figure of the past. And then you can think about who is Charlie, that vision of the future, that vision of someone so young who will take the station into its next generation. Right, so we are going to continue on this juxtaposition of family life within this home and the weight of history as we move into the study. So here we have the text of the poem, The Children's Hour, with a view of a study with a round center table cluttered with books and writing implements. A standing desk sits on a second round table in front of a window. The room has brown wallpaper and deep red curtains and carpet. There is also an ornately carved black armchair in the foreground, which is sort of just off to the left side of where the photo fades. But again, this room is Henry Longfellow's study. It's where he wrote many of his best known works, mostly at that little standing desk you can see. And this room, not unlike the front hallway, knits together the connection between the poet and the past. This study was most likely George Washington's war room, so his council chamber where he met with his generals and strategized on ending the siege of Boston. As it becomes Henry Longfellow's workspace, he's communing with Washington, but it's also a family space. His kids are constantly in and out of this room. So again, a very active, lively, lived-in space. So once again, any phrases that especially catch your ear are going to go into the chat as we consider an excerpt from the Children's Hour. And with all of these poems, I'm going to recommend reading the whole thing when you have a chance. This is written in 1863. By 1863, Henry Longfellow has been widowed a second time. His wife Fanny dies in a very sad and very sudden household accident, leaving him with 5 living children at home, the youngest of whom is just 5 years old. So his 3 daughters are approximately 5, 7, and 10 at this time. And here is a little scene of them joining him in the study. Between the dark and the daylight, when the night is beginning to lower, comes a pause in the day's occupations that is known as the children's hour. I hear in the chamber above me the patter of little feet, the sound of a door that is opened, and voices soft and sweet. From my study I see in the lamplight, descending the broad hall stair, grave Alice and laughing Allegra, and Edith with golden hair. A whisper and then a silence, yet I know by their merry eyes they are plotting and planning together to take me by surprise. A sudden rush from the stairway, a sudden raid from the hall. By these 3 doors left unguarded they enter my castle wall. They climb up into my turret, over the arms and back of my chair. If I try to escape, they surround me. They seem to be everywhere. They almost devour me with kisses, their arms about me entwine, till I think of the Bishop of Bingen in his mouse tower on the Rhine. Susan has pulled out plotting and planning, the castle and the turret. It's very imaginative. I think he's captured in a wonderful way these sort of mischievous and loving children. Edward has a sudden rush from the stairway. Who is the Bishop of Bingen? I would encourage you to look that up, but Henry's making sort of a literary reference here. They almost devour me with kisses. Yes, thank you, Asmina, for putting that in the chat as well. This is a very sweet sort of personal family scene between a dad and his three very loving daughters. Henry is very, very active as a parent. He's very present in his children's life, both before and then especially after Fanny passes away. And so in this very sort of storied room, we see a sweet family scene. Henry is at the peak of his poetic career at this point, and he writes this really charming poem, which becomes very popular about his three playful daughters. This poem utilizes the house itself as a recognizable setting. As much as Henry was in the public eye, his house was kind of known. It was a place of public interest. It was Washington's headquarters. People tried to come and see it and see him here. So he uses this house as a recognizable setting to tell a story about the ideals of family. And this is also a really interesting period in our culture in the second half of the 19th century, when we're becoming a sort of much more child-centric culture. Birthday parties and children's Christmas parties and a whole toy industry and a children's book publishing industry are taking off around this time. And so this is a very appealing image of a family. And at the same time, I think really reflects what we know of the reality of Henry and his children in, again, this very sort of historic space. So we're going to move to our last Longfellow poem, and then we'll do one bonus poem. It's also connected to the history of the home. We've moved upstairs into a little bit of a plainer space. Here we see the text of, it says Gold Ring Room, and then the poem, The Cross of Snow. We see a bedroom with a low sleigh bed, a green couch, and a blue and gold folding screen. Notably, on the left side, there's a portrait of a woman hanging above a fireplace opposite the bed, and a gold ring is on the ceiling above the bed. So this was Henry and Fanny's bedroom. It is an intimate space. The bed dates to 1843. It was a place where the Longfellow children were born. It's where Fanny passed away. It's eventually where Henry passed away almost 20 years later. And the gold ring, if you're wondering, is for some sort of bed hangings, netting, or canopy. This is a very private space, excuse me, referenced in a rather private poem, which was only published after Henry Longfellow died, about 4 years after he died, by his beloved younger brother, Sam. And so Sam edits his older brother's papers. Sam Longfellow is a reverend. He's an abolitionist and a suffragist, a very, very thoughtful person who's tremendously close to the family and lives in the house later in his life. And he chooses to publish this poem that Henry did not make public, which is maybe Longfellow's most personal work. It's a very short poem. It's here in its entirety, and I'll read it for you now. Again, any resonant phrases can go in the chat. In the long, sleepless watches of the night, a gentle face, the face of one long dead, looks at me from the wall, where round its head the night lamp casts a halo of pale light. Here in this room she died, and soul more white never through martyrdom of fire was led to its repose, nor can in books be read the legend of a life more benedight. There is a mountain in the distant west that, sun defying, in its deep ravines displays a cross of snow upon its side. Such is the cross I wear upon my breast these 18 years, through all the changing scenes and seasons, changeless since the day she died. The portrait upon which the night lamp casts a halo of pale light is the same portrait that you can sort of see here above the fireplace. It's a very beautiful, simple portrait of Fanny from late in her life, from about 1859. She's 40 years old. The cross imagery, such as the cross I wear upon my breast, is coming out in the chat. Someone else is picking out the long, sleepless watches of the night. I think that is a very relatable encapsulation in some ways. Changeless since the day she died. Patricia says that's very resonant for any widow or widower. And it has been 18 years. And Henry keeps her in his heart, in his mind, in this space in particular. And Henry and Fanny Longfellow had a very, very close partnership. It was a close emotional and intellectual partnership. She helped him with his poetry. They traveled together. She was literary. She was educated. She was artistic. He referred to her as a woman of genius. She was a tremendously devoted family member and mother to her children. Fanny Longfellow's letters and journals remain in tremendous number in the site's archival collections. And she's a real intellect, she's a real wit, she's a real shrewd observer of the world around her. But Henry did not write a lot about her after she died. He was so deep in his grief. But what he did do was he chose to preserve her papers. When his first wife, Mary Storer Potter, passed away when they were both very young, he destroyed her papers. He was in his grief. He could not save them or look at them. And with Fanny, he makes a different choice, perhaps a choice that reflects his greater maturity at that time, to preserve her papers so still today she can speak to us in her own words. And Fanny Longfellow has a really beautiful recollection in her journal from early on in their residency here, where she's speaking about, they're actually living with they have some boarders at the time, and finally their boarders are gone, and she and Henry have her marital house all to themselves, and she talks about running through the halls, just in the delight of occupying this space. And then she reflects on what the years ahead will hold. And there's a really beautiful comment in the chat about these letters and journals allow Fanny to speak to her children after she was gone. I love that as a way to think about the preservation of them as well, which they certainly did. She wrote really beautifully about her children. And I don't know for certain, but I hope and I imagine that her children had the opportunity to read those as they were archived in their own house. So we are now going to leave behind Henry Longfellow. He was a very private man. He was a very public figure, right? This is an intensely personal poem that he wrote. It wasn't meant to sort of instruct or inspire the public. It was meant to capture his own feelings. And his life was really one of both great grief and great joy. And so much of that took place, if you will, within these walls. Before we break for a Q&A, I want to just briefly consider the library. So this is a large room furnished with ornately carved wooden library table and bookcases. It has a couch, it has chairs, 5 big windows with red curtains, and we have the text of a poem by Phillis Wheatley, written in 1775 to His Excellency George Washington. So we're going to step away from Longfellow to just consider one more important poem that had to do with this house that shaped both historic events and public memory. Many of you may be familiar with Phillis Wheatley. She was born in West Africa around 1753. She was kidnapped as a 7-year-old, trafficked to Boston and sold as an enslaved child to the Wheatley family. For whatever reason, the Wheatleys sort of recognized a literary talent. They allowed her to be educated, and Phillis became published as a poet during her period of enslavement. Excuse me, she published her book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, in 1774. So this is its, I believe, 250th anniversary this year. And about a month later, she was freed following its publication, perhaps in response to pressure, especially from British abolitionists. This book was published to great acclaim, particularly in England. And less than a year later, she wrote a poem to George Washington. Now, this room, the library, was the room where George Washington's secretaries and aides received and responded to correspondence. And one of the pieces of correspondence they received in the early fall of 1775 was from Phillis Wheatley, and she enclosed a poem celebrating the new general in charge of this effort for American liberty from England. I will read you a selection from the poem, which is, you'll get a sense. It's much more excuse me for the laser pointer still being on. It's a little bit more 18th century than Henry's 19th. She writes, celestial choir, enthroned in realms of light, Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write. While freedom's cause her anxious breast alarms, she flashes dreadful in refulgent arms. See Mother Earth her offspring's fate bemoan, and nations gaze at scenes before unknown. See the bright beams of heaven's revolving light involved in sorrows in the veil of night. One century scarce performed its destined round when Gallic powers Columbia's fury found, and so may you, whoever dares disgrace the land of freedom's heaven-defended race. Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. Anon Britannia drops the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine with gold unfading, Washington, be thine. So I think this is a very interesting poem, worth spending quite a bit more time with. And there's a great question in the chat that I'll address in a moment as well. But this is really complicated. So when Washington receives this poem, he's the new commander of the army. He is the enslaver of about 130 people at his home and plantation in Virginia, Mount Vernon. Several of them, including William Lee, are here with him at headquarters. At the time he receives Phillis Wheatley's poem in the fall of 1775, George Washington is also working on segregating the Continental Army and removing Black soldiers from its ranks. He eventually does that at the end of 1775 and then quickly reverses his decision following pressure from Black veterans, as well as the practical concern really of an enlistment crisis. So Washington does allow the army to be reintegrated, which is sort of a strategic decision. And all of that is going on while he has Phillis Wheatley's poem praising him sort of in his back pocket. He has not yet responded to her. In February of 1776, so several months after he receives this poem from Phillis Wheatley, who again is pretty well known and very well regarded in the colonies at this point, he decides to write back to her. And in the Google Doc, you can find a link to the letter that he writes her, which he addresses Mrs. Phillis. And so there's been some really interesting work by the historian J.L. Bell, who wrote our Washington Historic Resource Study here, sort of reflecting on how Washington writes to a free Black woman whose poetry, at least, he's holding in high regard. He's used to addressing married ladies as Mrs. last name. He's only used to addressing Black women as their first name. And so he appears to sort of split the difference here and address her as Mrs. Phillis. In this letter, he praises her poetic talents. He thanks her for the poem. He says that he would love to publish it, but he doesn't want to be thought vain. He just wants to show her talents off to the world, but he doesn't want people to think that he's vain for publishing the poem, so sadly he can't do it. He closes the letter by inviting her to visit him at headquarters if she should ever find herself in Cambridge, which has led to much speculation. Unfortunately, we do not have any proof that indicates that Phillis Wheatley was ever able to visit headquarters, but it is, again, this very, very fraught, complex, and interesting interaction. George Washington then turns around and sends a copy of this poem to his secretary, Joseph Reed, and heavily hints that he should publish it in a Philadelphia newspaper, which Reed does. Again, this is a very complimentary poem to Washington, and it shows that Phillis Wheatley is sort of on his side. And for Washington, a Southern enslaver, he needs he finds useful a sort of endorsement like this among Northerners in particular who are skeptical of him as a Southern enslaver. So this is strategic for Washington. Phillis Wheatley, her poetry also raises in prominence again in association with Washington. So it is sort of strategic on both sides. So this is this remarkable and very complicated interaction. George Washington's star, of course, continues to rise throughout the following decades. Phillis Wheatley experiences a pretty difficult remainder of her life, though today she's really been in many ways reclaimed and celebrated as both America's first published Black poet, an enduring literary influence, a community member of the free and enslaved Black community in Boston, and through some of her less known poems, a powerful abolitionist. So this is an interaction that I do not know. I imagine that Henry Longfellow was aware of, but it's an interesting interaction with a poem that characterizes the earlier history of the house and some of the complexities around Washington's headquarters. All right. So we're still seeing the library here. This is just closing with an invitation to visit us. So we are reopening for our public tour season on Friday, May 17th. We'll be open Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday through October 28th. You can get all the details of tours and other opportunities at nps.gov/Longfellow, and then click on how to visit inside the house. We also will be rolling out our Summer Arts Festival. So live poetry, music, family events, a Juneteenth gathering on the lawn. And if you'd like to pick up the story of Phyllis Wheatley and George Washington, we are about to announce an event for April 27th with the incredible poet Tony B and Professor Nicole Aljo. We'll be doing a poetry workshop and lecture inspired by this interaction between Wheatley and Washington. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that I can take a peek at your questions in the Q&A. So before I pop back over to the Q&A, I do see a great question. How was ownership of the house determined after Vassal left and after Washington's occupancy? So it would be sold and owned by others. The Vassal House was essentially, considered abandoned loyalist property. So the provincial Congress governing sort of Patriot Massachusetts during the war, it was in Cambridge, it was sort of on this side of the line. So the provincial Congress was able to furnish it, essentially seize it as abandoned property, furnish it for Washington. And then it was the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that after the American Revolution auctioned it essentially, or actually during the late Revolution. In 1781, they sold it to Nathaniel Tracy, and then it changed hands privately a couple of times after that. So it's again considered abandoned loyalist property. John Vassal, for his part, is in England. He files a claim to the Loyalist Commission asking to be compensated for his lost colonial property, which I believe is denied based on his still very extensive holdings of human beings and property in Jamaica. And yes, Wendy, Longfellow did originate the phrase, the patter of little feet, in the children's hour. So I'm going to go through the Q&A. So great question. What year is this dining room showing as? Okay, complicated answer. I'll try to do as quickly as possible. It's showing 1912. It's showing 1850s through the lens of 1912. So Alice Longfellow, again, she lives actively in all of this house throughout her life. She died in 1928. Her nephew continued to live in it until 1950, but she was really a preservationist, as was her nephew, Harry. They were very interested in sort of freezing as much as possible, especially on the first floor, in time, continuing to use the furniture, the china, the belongings that referenced her father's period. So she did an inventory of the house in 1912, which is sort of officially how we display but it's 1912 sort of referencing the house that she grew up in and having just not moved very much around. So that's a really good question. How did the Appleton family make their fortune? Another fascinating question. I point people to go visit Lowell National Historical Park up north of Boston. Nathan Appleton was a textile investor. He was one of the earliest investors in the American Revolution in Massachusetts in the form of cotton textile manufacturing. So he's invested with Francis Cabot Lowell in Waltham, in Lowell. He's one of the city fathers, and then in Lawrence, Massachusetts. So he's one of the wealthiest men in Massachusetts. He also has bank and railroad stocks. Fannie has shares in the family textile mills. So Nathan Appleton, his business is actually very, very wrapped up in Southern slavery and the cotton economy. That leads to a falling out with Henry Longfellow's best friend, the outspoken abolitionist senator, Charles Sumner. So lots more to pull on with the Appletons as well. Judith asks, I noticed quite a few Chinese items in the dining room. Were they bought in America or did someone travel to China? Yes, thank you, Judy. There's a lot of East Asian artwork in the house. There's some Japanese pieces and some Chinese pieces in the dining room. That red altar table is a Buddhist altar table from Japan. And then there's some other ceramics on it. The Longfellow's oldest son, Charlie, so the one who was shouting at the apple tree to a child, he's the one. He leaves home at 18 to fight in the Civil War. Then he spends much of the rest of his life traveling, including spending about a year and a half living in Japan and spending the Appleton fortune. So he collects and collects and collects and consumes and sends home about 18 grades of incredible artwork, furniture, textiles, paintings, ceramics from Japan in particular. He also travels through China and collects there. He travels in India, North Africa, and all around. There's a virtual exhibit on our website from an in-person exhibit last summer about the Japan art collections. Pat, is there any needlework on display in the house? It's a wonderful question. There's at least one piece I can think of that was sent to Henry as a piece of fan art. In terms of family needlepoint, that would be a great question for our curator. You can look on our website in the collections information as well, but feel free to get in touch with a research question if you're interested particularly in other needlepoint in the house. Someone in the chat and in the Q&A asked, what was the accident that killed Fanny? Yeah, some folks may be familiar with this. It really, it made ripples at the time. She was seated in the library. It was the summer. She was apparently had just given her daughters haircuts, and like any good Victorian mother, she was sealing locks of their hair in envelopes using sealing wax. Somehow her dress caught fire, perhaps the candle, the wax itself. She was, it was July, she's wearing a very light cotton dress, and her dress caught fire. She goes into the next room. Henry tries to put her dress out, and she suffers very extensive burns, and died the next day at home. Henry also sustains some more minor burns, and he's just absolutely traumatized by this. Again, they still have 5 young children at home. Her daughters witnessed at least some part of this accident. Their home seems to hold enough importance and joy to them that they can, continue to exist in this space. But it's awful. And it's so abrupt, and he grieves her for the rest of his life. There is another question in the chat about, how did both of his wives? So I'll talk a little bit about Mary Storer Potter, who never lived in this house, but she's a very important person in her own right. She was sort of the girl next door. They both grew up in Henry and Mary in Portland, Maine. Henry attended Bowdoin College, then he married, then he traveled in Europe to learn a bunch of languages so he could teach them. Then he married Mary Storer Potter Longfellow. About 2 years into their marriage, they were traveling in Europe. She was pregnant, and she suffered complications from either a miscarriage or a stillbirth later in her pregnancy. So this is, again, like very unbelievably tragic for Mary, for her family, for Henry, who stays in Europe. He just sort of continues traveling and grieving. He actually meets Fanny in Europe about 6 months later, and her family is there, and starts to try to court her. But every time, and you see this in Henry's journals and Fanny's as well, every time Fanny gives birth to one of their 6 children, she has, very healthy pregnancies and births. He is just terrified, and he's so relieved and effusive every time she's safe and their child is safe. On a separate, totally separate but related note, one of my favorite anecdotes from the house, Fanny Longfellow is the first American to use anesthesia in childbirth. She inhaled ether in 1847 for the birth of her 3rd child, a daughter also named Fanny. And she had a very positive experience, so much so that then Henry the next day went to the dentist and had a tooth pulled under the influence of ether. So this is shortly after the ether dome and the first ether surgeries in Boston, but Fanny's following along. She has the connections and the resources to try this in childbirth. Let's see one more question in the chat, which is, I was surprised to see a standing desk. Were these popular at this time period? I don't know exactly how popular they were. That's a great question. I've seen there's one, I believe, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, at the Wayside in Concord. There's a sort of writing turret of Nathaniel Hawthorne's, and I think he has a similar standing desk up there. Yeah, I mean, Henry's got the whole home office with his standing desk, right? He was kind of ahead of his time, but he was pretty active. He loved to take long walks to Boston and back. He liked to stand. He liked to look out that window and look down to the Charles River, which he could see, it was tidal at the time, and take inspiration there. Yes, somebody in the chat says, I think Hawthorne's work desk was standing, so can vouch for that. Yeah, if anybody's seen any other 19th century, work desk at his job, like in the customs house. So he may have gotten used to that. Great. If anybody's seen any other 19th century standing desks at other historic houses, pop them in the chat. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. If anyone would like to share those in the chat or in the, oh my gosh, there were a whole bunch of questions I didn't scroll down to see. Okay. So excuse me.
That's okay, Emily. I was going to catch those.
Okay. Where did Phyllis Wheatley live at this time? She was living in Boston. Would like to be more of an expert on Phyllis Wheatley than I am. We will be live streaming and hosting in person this upcoming lecture with Tony B and Nicole Aljo, who will shed a lot more light on her life and her community at this time. She was in Boston, I believe. Does the NPS manage any other houses of American poets? Yes. So there are several other literary homes in the National Park System. Carl Sandburg National Historic Site is Carl Sandburg's house. There is not a poet per se, but another literary house, the Eugene O'Neill National Historic Site, out in the East Bay in California. I'm probably blanking on some. Many other poets' homes are not. So actually, although the Minuteman National Historical Park, which is primarily Lexington and Concord, Revolutionary War, the home of authors, so that Bronson Alcott, Nathaniel Hawthorne, space, is managed by the National Park Service as well. And Robert says Phyllis Wheatley lived in Wilmington for a bit as well. Steve says Reverend Ripley had a standing desk at the Old Manse. So there's good precedents. And yeah, we have a vote of confidence on the standing desk in the attic of the Wayside. But yeah, the National Park System actually contains by the numbers more sites of historical significance than it does like big natural areas. So all of them have historical significance, but there are many, many historic houses managed by the National Park Service. Does the tour include a discussion about the Asian art contained in the house? Yes, and if you have particular interest in that, you just absolutely let us know if you come on a tour. If I can find it, I'll send to Robert to send out afterwards a link to the exhibit about it as well. Were all of Longfellow's children with his second wife? Did they all live to adulthood? Yes, all of Longfellow's children were with his second wife. Mary died before any of their children could be born. So they were all Fanny and Henry's children. 5 out of the 6 lived to adulthood. Their daughter, their third child, Fanny, who unconnected to her birth using ether, died when she was 17 months old after a brief illness. Again, huge point of grief. Much higher child mortality during this period. And we had a lecture on this pretty recently where one of the historians, the question is often like, were people less emotionally attached to or engaged with their children during this period? And as far as we can tell, no, they had these very, very loving relationships. They felt about their kids like we do, but they had more of a social and cultural infrastructure around talking about death and grieving and bereavement of children. And you see Fanny writing to a friend who had experienced something similar and said, I know you can understand this. So 5 out of their 6 children did live to adulthood, but one of them passed away. How is Longfellow connected to the Wayside Inn in Sudbury? Yes, Longfellow's Wayside Inn. So he hung out there and wrote his Tales from a Wayside Inn, sort of his Longfellow's Canterbury Tales in association with that historic site. Any mention during the tour of Edmonia Lewis and the sculpture she made of Longfellow when he and his children visited Rome? Not typically, unless it comes up. This is my favorite bust of Longfellow. He chose not to acquire it, which I find horrifying. I do not know what he thought of it. I do not know if this had to do with Edmonia Lewis being a Black and Indigenous woman and also well-regarded sculptor, but she did this fabulous bust of Longfellow, which is in the Harvard Art Museums. So it is definitely worth a mention, and it's absolutely worth going to the Harvard Art Museums and taking a look at. She sculpted Longfellow actually when they were both in Rome. So he was traveling and she was living there among sort of these expat women artists in Rome. And the last question that I see, Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, was Cuba successful in her quest for reparations? Thank you for asking. So we do a deep dive tour on the history of enslavement and freedom, where we go quite a bit further into this. We also have a pretty extensive article on our website called "Though Dwelling in the Land of Freedom." And the answer is yes. Cuba and her husband, Tony, were successful in their quest for reparations. They had to file 2 petitions to the Massachusetts General Court, which is essentially the legislature in the 1780s. First petition comes in 1781 as the Commonwealth is preparing to auction off the John Vassall estate. And they first petitioned for reparations in the form of land. They say, we'd like the deed to 1 acre of this land that we've been farming, we've been improving, we were enslaved by John Vassall for all of these decades. This is due to us. And that petition seems to not be heard. They then turn around, and several months later, in February of 1780, excuse me, the first one was 1780, 1781, they file a second petition, which is requesting a pension out of an annual pension out of the sale of John Vassall's estate. And this one is successful. So Tony Vassall, Kuba's husband, is granted a 12-pound annual pension for the remainder of his life. And I will just briefly say, this is what I spend much of my day thinking about, is that the language in their petition is so strategic, and they likely were prevented from learning to write. So we believe that they wrote this petition in collaboration with a supported community member. If folks are familiar with the Belinda Sutton petition, the Royal House and Slave Quarters, go visit them. It's a wonderful story to learn about as well, or a powerful story to learn about as well. This flurry of sort of reparations petition in the early 1780s. So this is similar to Belinda's petition. That pension is granted, and so Tony Vassall collects a 12-pound annual pension for the rest of his life. And the strategic language in this is pointing out, though dwelling in a land of freedom, both himself and his wife have spent 60 years of their lives in slavery. So they're pointing to, this is supposed to be the land of freedom. This is supposed to be the cradle of liberty. Why were we enslaved for 60 years? And we were owed, at the very least, this debt out of our former enslavers' estate. So that's granted. Eventually, Kuba, after Tony dies, gets the pension transferred to her name. She passed away shortly after, but they both lived to a very, very old age. Tony potentially into his 90s, Kuba into her late 70s, and their next generation, Darby Vassall and their other children, are active, very active in the community as well. Right. Well, I will wrap it there. We are right at the hour. Thank you so much. This was a real pleasure to come in and speak with you, to see your reflections on the poetry in the chat, to hear your really thoughtful questions. And I hope to see some of you in person or online coming up this season. So thank you again. And thank you so much to Robert for the invitation.
Thank you, Emily. So folks, let's give Emily a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation, and look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to this recording, a link to a feedback survey, information about some other upcoming programs, a link to the all the poems that were referenced today. And Emily, if you have anything else you want me to pass along, feel free to send it my way.
Great.
So thank you all so much. Happy National Poetry Month, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again, Emily.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.